The specific thing I really wanted to talk about on this podcast, and
Mm-hmm.
what I prepared the PowerPoint slideshow for,
Yeah.
was the actual mechanisms by which sex differentiation works in humans, and why the notion of biological sex, quote unquote, and particularly the idea that it amounts to just chromosomes, doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you understand how it actually works.
I'm kind
And why
of.
we should also, just in an objective sense, not like a political sense, but why you should consider trans people who have been on HRT for a while biologically their gender, not just,
Yeah.
you know, mentally
No, but
it.
gametes. It's kind of interesting because like I have spoken about this like numerous times, but I haven't gone like in depth into like the science behind it. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
how the term like a biological female male actually doesn't really make any sense. I
Mm-hmm.
think you even talked about on Blue Sky a while ago how a lot of times when you have like a medication, if you like it doesn't or like it's not about like you being born male or you being born
Mm-hmm.
female that like changes how the
One
medication
example
affects you.
I like to cite is how migraines are about equally common for males and females as children.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but men usually grow out of it as adults. And the thing it and usually don't have migraines anymore as adults. It's kind of uncommon for adult men to have migraines. If you are, say, a trans woman and you had migraines as a child and you go on HRT, you will start having migraines again.
Because it's like estrogen
Conversely,
related.
if you're a trans man and you have migraines and you're on AT for a while, you're likely to stop having migraines.
Mm-hmm. Like a lot of things are impacted by the hormones that you have in your body, not necessarily by you being
Mhm.
born a certain way. I'm kind of thinking about like how can I share the slideshow of this because if I start the slideshow, it's going to like go into like full screen, and I don't want this to be like my full screen thingy. Recenter view.
The actual mechanism
Oh,
behind this
there we
is
go.
interesting because the mechanism behind migraines is the blood vessels that pass like through gaps in the skull for things like your eyes and ears and stuff. Um, Dilating and physically pressing down on the nerve bundles that also pass through those openings. Um, and estrogen encourages vasodilation, while testosterone encourages vasoconstriction, which is also, of course, the reason why the rates are different in cis men and cis women. Mm.
Okay, I think I have this in my screen set up. So if you want to do like the slideshow, just let me know if I like when I should move forward. I think we can yap about certain things, but I also don't really want to
Here, I treat
interrupt your
migraines by
flow.
microdosing testosterone. There are like more specific vasoconstrictive medications used for migraines, actually. Um,
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering how you want to do this. If I just want
I'll tell you when the next slide.
okay, do you want to like talk about certain things, or do you just want to have like your little presentation? We can talk about it afterwards.
We can talk about during it. Don't be afraid to ask
Okay.
questions.
Okay. I will
So, the first slide is just the title, which is
mhm.
Mechanisms of Human Sex Differentiation, and the subtitle, Sex isn't really genetic, actually, it's epigenetic.
And I'm guessing you're going to
Next
explain
slide.
that
Yes, I
soon.
will. So, you probably learned in school or through just cultural osmosis this idea that XX means female, XY means male, Everyone starts as female, and men have nipples despite them being quote unquote useless. That's not actually accurate, as I'm going to get to. And the Y chromosome encodes all the male traits, while the X chromosome encodes both male and female ones, which is again not true. Next slide.
All of them are wrong.
Yeah, all these are wrong.
Mm-hmm.
This is a bit on the history of our understanding of chromosomes. Theodore Boveri first discovered chromosomes are vectors of heredity. Nettie Maria Stevens discovered sex chromosomes to determine sex in mammals. Techniques of karyotyping developed in the following decades, and so on. Next slide.
Do you happen to know when words like male and female were actually being used? Because I think they were being used before this was like even discovered when it comes to like chromosomes.
They're pretty old,
and so on.
yeah.
And
they're pretty old, I believe.
Yeah, and I think it's like what I find interesting is that like people are like pushing the idea that like, oh no, we know that like XX means female and thus that means woman, but like we knew the word female.
Oh yeah, all the turf bullshit about how we can instinctively sense sex.
Yeah, exactly. It's just. Yeah, I'm not
they
entirely
often
sure.
Like state pheromones or some shit either.
Oh yeah, fertility.
Also, despite the fact that the human vomeronasal organ, which is what mammals use to sense pheromones, is actually vestigial, non-functional, and doesn't even have an opening into the nasal cavity.
Yeah. What I find interesting.
Humans might still make pheromones, but we can't sense them.
Exactly. What I find interesting, I had like one tweet that triggered a lot of like conservatives and like right wingers and so on, when it was like the majority of people are not attracted to like reproductive organs, or are not like attracted to people just because of their reproductive organs and so on. And a lot of them are like pushing the idea like, oh, that is invalidating gay people because gay relationships are between a penis haver and a penis haver, or a vagina haver and a vagina haver.
I think you could ask most gay people about that and they'd say no.
Yeah, I think that like attraction and so on, and like how we perceive certain people is just, it is way more complex than just like XX, XY and so on. And like just fertility brain.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can't even sense pheromones, correct? We can't sense pheromones. We no longer have the organ to do so.
Don't you know there's the pheromone-infused tactical soap? Military grade
I know, it's so funny, all this conversation about pheromones and knowing that, like, humans cannot sense pheromones. We don't have an anatomy required.
Sometimes people just smell nice, right? Like if you shower and you have like a nice shampoo and soap or something, like people just smell nice, and it's nice when you have like somebody who smells nice. No, it's the pheromones.
Can we go to the next slide?
Yes.
So, at first, scientists thought the Y chromosome encoded everything there is about being quote-unquote male. That is, all male traits and differences from femaleness. When we discovered genes in the structure of the genome, we assumed that the Y chromosome was full of male genes. You might have still been taught like exactly this in school, but it's not true, as we'll get into with the next slide.
Yeah.
So one problem with these assumptions is demonstrated with when XYY syndrome was discovered, which is some men have 2 Y chromosomes. When it was first discovered, people assumed it would make you a super male with uncontrolled muscle growth and heightened aggressiveness and competitiveness and stuff. And people like blamed it for urban crime and serial killers, saying they probably have multiple Y chromosomes and that's why they're like that.
Oh my god.
And as we go, and next slide. The truth, it has no substantial symptoms whatsoever. There are no real significant differences whatsoever between someone with XYY and someone with XY chromosomes. At all. There's also other contradictions. We have women who are born with XY chromosomes Swire syndrome, androgen insensitivity syndrome, and XX males like De La Chapelle syndrome. Some people with these karyotypes are even fertile. They can have kids.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
What I find interesting is that,
and
you know, you always have TERS be like, oh yeah, but like exceptions don't break the rules or like something, right? It's just,
what I always like to say is that science doesn't have exceptions; it has counterexamples.
yeah. And another like
You
factor.
don't get to say that doesn't count in
Yeah.
science. If your
Yeah.
theory doesn't account for it, your theory is wrong.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that a lot of people, a lot of like these believers in biological reality, it's just like they don't understand how science works or like scientific methods and so on.
Mm,
And they just think it's just another belief system.
yeah. Also, like how I said, having two Y chromosomes doesn't really have any symptoms at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some men have a disorder where their Y chromosome actually disappears.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they don't have a Y chromosome as an adult. This also has no significant symptoms other than they can't make properly functioning sperm.
Because it doesn't really carry that much information as like people initially
As we'll
assumed.
get to, yes.
Yeah.
And the next slide. So, what genes are on the Y chromosome? First, it's the largest gene desert in the human genome. Um, the so you might have heard that most of your DNA is not genes. This is especially the case for the Y chromosome. Only a very, very small portion of the DNA on it is actually coding genes. There's about 19,000 genes you have in total, and there's only about 60 to 80 on the Y chromosome, which means that's about 0.3% of your total genes.
Next slide.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So this is a diagram of different genes that are found on the Y chromosome, and different regions of it, which I'm going to get into. Here I don't really have slides explaining stuff, so just stay on this for a while.
Okay.
Here at the ends, we have what's called the pseudo-autosomal region. What I mean by pseudo-autosomal is an autosome is a normal chromosome. It's not a sex chromosome. It freely exchanges DNA during meiosis with its partner chromosome. And we call these regions pseudo-autosomal because they freely exchange with the X chromosome. Meaning, by definition, all the genes that are in this part of the Y chromosome are also found on the X chromosome. Which means none of these genes can have anything to do with sex differentiation, obviously.
Okay. Yeah.
Here in the short arm euchromatin, we have a number of genes, of which SRY is a very important one, which we'll get to. The rest, however, are similar to the pseudo-autosomal region genes in that they're just homologs of genes on the X chromosome. They don't freely interchange with their counterparts like the pseudo-autosomal region does, but they're still just the same as X chromosome genes. They might be like slightly different, but are broadly the same. And then we have the long arm euchromatin with the AZF gene regions. These are important to the proper function and creation of sperm, which is why Y chromosome deletion causes infertility. But SRY here, that is the gene responsible for sex determination. You might have heard this because transphobes have recently gotten obsessed with this over chromosomes, saying like, oh, actually, it's whether you have an SRY gene or not.
Yeah.
But this also doesn't make sense for reasons I'll get into when I talk about how the SRY gene actually works.
Yeah, how
anyways,
like,
next slide.
Sometimes the SRY gene can be found on the X chromosome, so they can still have like
that's the dick
male
and balls gene,
characteristics or
yes.
something,
You
right?
ask, no, it's not, and I'll explain that.
Okay.
So next slide.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yep, it's just one gene, and it's S or Y, and no, it's not encoding all male traits in one gene. And we're going to have to update your understanding of how genes actually work for this. Next slide. So in biology and particularly genetics, we have something called the central dogma, which is the idea that genetic information goes one way. DNA is transcribed into RNA, and RNA is translated into protein. And proteins have no effect on DNA. This is true to a certain extent in that proteins don't like actually alter your DNA, and neither does RNA. But it's not really true that it only flows one way, that DNA dictates everything, as we'll get to. So the next slide.
Do you wanna explain the difference between DNA and RNA?
Oh, yes. So I'd have to get into highly technical things of how DNA is like composed of slightly different stuff than RNA. But the real difference in terms of stuff is that RNA is more reactive than DNA, which makes it worse for long-term storage, but better at actively participating in chemical reactions.
I think there was like RNA, a lot of people were exposed to that during like COVID and so on. Like when they first learned
Well,
it's like a thing that like evolves a lot or it's like quickly and so on.
is COVID an RNA virus? It might be. Let me check this just
I
to say this conversation.
I think it is.
Oh, it is an RNA virus.
Yeah.
Yeah, some viruses are actually RNA viruses, and that's an exception to the RNA doesn't modify DNA, because RNA viruses do actually do that. That's another exception to the central dogma.
Okay.
And this is just the part where I say it's wrong.
Okay.
So, next slide.
E.
So RNA polymerase II is the enzyme, which is like a functional protein that binds to DNA and, transcribes it into RNA so that can then be translated into protein. However, it doesn't just bind to genes on its own. It doesn't just randomly bounce around and grab genes. There are a ton of proteins, histones, activators, repressors, that dictate where, when, and how much RNA polymerase actually transcribes a gene by physically bonding to that part of the genome and altering its like actual physical geometry within the nucleus, like folding and unfolding your DNA, sort of like origami. It's very cool. Most of the different proteins your body produces in which your DNA codes for are actually these regulatory proteins. They never leave the nucleus and exist only to control which genes get expressed and when. Often they either work on their own, but usually they respond to signal molecules that tell them to, which they respond to in order to determine whether they should express a gene or not. And the study of these regulatory mechanisms is called epigenetics, which is what I mentioned on the first slide.
Yeah.
Okay, and the next one. So where sex characteristics actually come from is they come from hormone-mediated differences in gene expression. That is, many of these regulator proteins rely specifically on hormones as signal molecules to dictate whether a gene should be transcribed. Why did I mess that up? This includes your sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, etc. And certain genes express themselves more or less depending on relative levels of sex hormones. This is one reason why I would say that trans people, once they've been on HRT for a while, are biologically male, biologically female, because the epigenetic expression of genes will have flipped.
I mean,
in fact, the entire reason you have different types of cells in different tissues in your body is because different genes are activated or deactivated via epigenetic mechanisms.
I mean,
in those cells.
There are also like the aspects when it comes to like your like neurobiology and so on when it comes to how.
Oh, I was gonna get to that.
Oh, you
Actually,
okay?
much later.
Okay, I don't wanna take away.
The next one is talking about how SRY does. SRY produces a regulatory protein called the SRY protein, obviously. Genes and their associated protein and the proteins they produce are usually named the same thing. Which upregulates the expression of a gene called SOX9 and downregulates the expression of two genes called WNT4 and RSPO1. These genes are not found on the sex chromosomes. SOX9 is found on chromosome 17. And I don't remember where WNT4 and RSPO1 are. SOX9 is itself a regulatory gene that basically says, hey, immature, undifferentiated gonads that haven't become testes or ovaries yet, you should do the changes that make you into testicles. Whereas WNT4 and RSPO1 say to make ovaries instead. And so what SRY does is it turns up SOX9 and it turns down WNT4 and RSPO1. SRY is only active during a very short window of fetal development, meaning it doesn't even actually do anything once you're born. Literally all it does is indicate whether your gonads should become testicles or ovaries, and literally every other sex difference is controlled by testes making more testosterone and ovaries making more estrogen.
Exactly. Next slide.
And this gets to those previous cases, explaining how this explains the previous cases I talked about, chromosomal abnormalities and why it doesn't work. The next slide.
Yeah, that's...
So XYY males. Having two Ys doesn't make a difference because all SRY does is kickstart the process and doesn't do anything after that. Y deletion, since they only affect fertility, since the only genes that aren't redundant with the X chromosome are related to sperm development. In XX males, one of their X chromosomes has the SRY gene transposed onto it. They usually can't make functional sperm because they lack the AZF regens and are thus infertile. But it does but because the other genes are found elsewhere in the genome and not the Y chromosome, it does become testicles and it does produce testosterone. Testosterone, not testosterone, what? Anyways, in XY females, there's two different things that usually cause it, which is either their Y chromosome lacks a functional copy of SRY, so the process never gets kickstarted, WNT4 and RSPO1 activate as they do by default and cause differentiation into ovaries. Or they simply have non-functional testosterone receptors, so their epigenetics don't respond to testosterone despite having testicles, and everything else differentiates as female.
You said initially some are still fertile?
Yeah, I believe some women with Swyer syndrome have given birth.
Okay. I'm wondering, like, what the difference there is that is like actually still.
So the thing to get is that people with women with androgen insensitivity syndrome actually have testicles. They're just in the place their ovaries would be. And the testosterone they make has no effect on them.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So they don't produce like estrogen then?
They don't produce as much estrogen as they would otherwise, but again, they're not responding to testosterone. They're only responding to the estrogen.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. Interesting.
The next slide.
Yeah. After a blueprint is
So
applied,
what you need to
it's just a matter
understand
of
here
hormones. I mean,
yeah.
Well,
it's not really a blueprint. It's just this one gene that triggers differentiation of the gonad specifically. Anyways, All biological differences between male and female are quantitative, not qualitative. They're differences of degree, not essence. It is not binary. All sexed organs are actually present in all people. For example, like I mentioned, the ovaries and testes don't develop like completely separately. They're just two different pathways the gonads can take. But also, the reason men have nipples isn't because they used to be female. It's because everyone has breast tissue. They just never fully mature without exposure to estrogen and progesterone.
That's how like gynecomastia actually happen.
And they're not non-functional either. They're perfectly functional. Men can lactate.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a trans woman, like that can be like a side effect.
Is it possible that none of the differentiating genes fire in the fetus? I mean, there's a variety of reasons for that, and that also gets into some other intersex conditions that I didn't list. And changing your hormones changes your biological sex. Yes, this means trans women are biologically female.
Yeah.
And what does this mean for intersex people? Remember, all sex characteristics are determined by hormone levels, not directly encoded on the genes. Having an S or Y gene or not isn't the only thing that determines your hormone levels. Other genes affect them too, many of which are not on the sex chromosomes, and they can be affected by environmental factors too. Would it be possible to turn them into other gonads? You'd have to figure out how to make them regress into I forget what the term is for a cell that's like partially down a differentiation pathway but hasn't arrived at the final differentiation yet. Is it still called a stem cell?
I can't
when
help
it's
you
not
with that.
pluripotent anymore? I don't know. I don't remember the term. Anyways, you'd have to figure out how to make them undifferentiate, which is not something our bodies naturally have the capacity to do, undifferentiate cells. But it's something we have been working on for other reasons.
Like cancer or something? Wasn't it? Or what reasons?
Treating aging-related diseases in particular.
Okay. Gotcha.
If you could undifferentiate cells and then reproduce them in a lab, then you could inject them into someone to help them replace their cells. Partially differentiated stem cell, it might be that. Like I think the term here might specifically be we need to turn the gonads back into reproductive stem cells in order to do that. Anyways, atypical hormone levels during critical periods of development may result in the development of atypical sex characteristics, which is the case in most intersex conditions. And in fact, the last slide, one hypothesis and one I happen to subscribe to is that gender dysphoria is a consequence of intersexuality of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Just like everything else, there would be critical periods in brain development where it's being steered onto one pathway or another. And it's possible the hormone levels you're exposed to during that period may be different during other parts of than during other parts of development, which is the same thing that causes all the other intersex characteristics, is different hormones at different periods of development. This would mean that people with gender dysphoria literally have brains of their gender, not metaphorically. Like a trans woman with gender dysphoria has a female brain from their birth.
That's why gender euphoria is also like such a big indicator for you being trans.
Something which isn't often acknowledged in discourse for some reason is that there's a very big overlap between being transgender and having other intersex conditions.
Yeah.
Like, there's a very strong correlation between being intersex and being trans and vice versa. People often talk about intersex and trans people as different categories, especially TERFs who want to say, like, oh, trans people are just appropriating intersex people's struggles or whatever. But it's like, they're mostly the same people.
Yeah. It's also like these people, like TERFs and so on, they don't care about intersex people. They're also going to like invalidate intersex conditions and so on.
Which I also included a reminder here because of discourse. You don't need dysphoria to be trans, but dysphoria is real.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need an official diagnosis to claim dysphoria or whatever.
I think when it comes to gender dysphoria, there's also like a level of severity that probably indicates that it's not, a binary thing, but it's more like a spectrum. Have you ever talked
And there's a
about
bunch of other evidence that, like, yeah, gender dysphoria is caused by intersex conditions of the brain development.
Yeah.
And essentially you having a brain that expects your body to be different than it is.
Yeah,
And to be
exactly.
experiencing hormone levels that are different than they are.
Exactly. Like, I think one of the theories is that, like, when your body is being developed, there's like a surge of one hormone, and then when your brain is developed, there's a surge of like the opposite hormone, and that creates like the mismatch.
Well, it's not quite so. There's only two. There's a lot of different periods for different parts.
Yeah. Simplified.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm kind of the thing with like it being an intersex condition. I
Are there
subscribe
actual
to that as
male-female
well.
brains? Santa asks. Yes, however, I would caution against ascribing differences in male and female behavior to differences between male and female brains.
Yeah, brains are complex.
One particular example is female brains have more fat in them than male brains do, which may be an incidental consequence of differences in fat distribution between males and females overall. Yeah. There's also differences in the ratio of gray matter to white matter, and so on and so forth. I caution against over-interpreting this because just because a trait exists doesn't mean it fulfills some adaptive purpose.
Yeah, the thing that like a lot of trans
and
people...
this might be like pure, and this might just be random, essentially.
The thing that like a lot of trans people are also like breaking is obviously also like the concept of like, oh, what is like a male brain, what is a female brain? Because there are like some studies with like some...
Also here I linked an article specifically reviewing the evidence that gender dysphoria is a consequence of intersex development of the brain.
Gotcha.
Particularly it says that like things like the overall, like how I mentioned how the composition of male and female brains is slightly different. Trans people's brains match the gender we say we are, not the gender we were assigned at birth.
Do you happen to have like this graphic that like places trans women's brains like next to cis men and cis women? Because like if you use like
it's not obvious to the eye. If I could find a graphic for it, I would show it.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the differences aren't very obvious.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like there's a lot of invalidation that happens when you just like hyperfixate on the, oh, it's like a female brain that you have. Because some people are going to be like, well, actually, trans women's brains are closer to that of like gay men or something, like, right? It's just also like after HRT and
which is not
HRT.
what the evidence says. It says the evidence actually shows it's trans women's brains are virtually identical to cis women's.
Yeah. It's just a lot of people are going to twist a lot of these things. And also, I don't really like the idea that like in order to check if somebody is trans, they need to check their brain or something to like get validity.
That's what they brought up with you don't need to have gender dysphoria.
Exactly.
That like if you say you're trans, you're trans.
Exactly.
I don't believe in medical gatekeeping, but
yeah.
like we do, but probably your brain is different if you're trans.
It also invalidates a lot of non-binary people. Like,
which I would disagree about it potentially invalidating non-binary people, because I suspect, although I haven't seen studies on this, that non-binary people's brains might be in between male and female.
I think it's just because it's because it's like it's a spectrum, right? And like you're somewhere in the spectrum, and I think there's also like a difference between like gender dysphoria and like
Yeah,
sex
that's also a thing I
dysphoria.
emphasized, is that because sexual characteristics are responses to different relative levels of sex hormones.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a
Like
spectrum. They're all a spectrum.
like for me, for instance, I had severe bottom dysphoria, right? To the point where I needed surgery. And that is more like me having this mismatch between like my sex characteristics, right?
Yes.
So there's always like a level, and like some people don't have that, and it
There's
doesn't
some
make them less
research
valid.
linking that kind of dysphoria to phantom limb syndrome. If you've heard about how people who have lost a limb
Yeah.
experience this uncomfortable sensation of like seemingly their subconscious knowing the limb should still be there and
Yeah.
reporting sensations for it that are often like deeply uncomfortable. There's some research linking that to the way trans people feel about our bodies.
Yeah. It's just there's something that is just like it doesn't
It's your
connect with your
brain is
brain.
telling you this is not what my body is supposed to be like.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I think that, these people are always like, oh, it's common sense, it's basic biology. And then, like, you look deeper into it, and it's just like, it's way more complex than
Yeah.
that.
Meanwhile, biologists are having actual discourse about retiring the terms male and female entirely.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Biologists are going woke. They're erasing male and female.
It's funny. I posted about this on Blue Sky, but one thing, despite like journalists being incredibly transphobic and writing transphobic shit all the time, while that may influence other people in society, it's not going to influence scientists, because your average scientist has nothing but contempt for journalists.
Yeah.
Oh my god. The only like profession scientists respect less than journalists is politicians.
Valid. Yeah, I think that like in science we are like still kind of advancing. It just sucks that like the research is being cut and funding is being cut, because I think that like researching trans healthcare and so on would teach also cis people about their own bodies, and also help with a lot of
I forget, Traeger, you say male and female still useful for describing a reproductive role. Yes. However, what scientists are actually proposing is replacing them with more technical terms that more directly describe like gametes.
yeah. It's also like
There's a couple different proposals I've seen. Usually it's taking terminology from like botany and describing like trees and
interesting.
applying them to animals.